why don't we go ahead and get started? So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Carmen Phelps. Dr. Phelps is an experienced DEI thought leader and strategic planner with a background as a researcher and educator in race, cultural, and gender studies. She has successfully designed and initiated results-oriented DEI and racial equity-focused programs, workshops, trainings, and discussions for senior leaders, people managers, and staff that encourage learning, reflection, awareness, and understanding, as well as community building across difference, with the goal of inspiring organizational growth and progress, as well as equitable and just outcomes for diverse staff and communities. Carmen, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hello, Casey. Thank you so much for that opening and introduction. Really, Casey, grateful to you for inviting me to facilitate this discussion today. I see the numbers are still climbing. We've got about 15 or so folks in this learning space at this point, and just really want to welcome all of you and express gratitude that you have taken time to invest in this subject as part of this event. Really glad you're here. So we're calling this Promoting DEI in Interdisciplinary Grant-Making Processes and in the Grant Management Profession and Higher Ed and Beyond. And this will be an interactive session. So, we're going to be encouraging engagement, reflection, thinking, sharing, etc. And we've got a small enough group, at least thus far, but we'll continue to welcome folks to the space as we move forward. But we've got a small enough group that we can hear from one another and share some ideas, questions, comments, reactions, etc. To the material as we move forward. So always want to welcome folks to do that. You can use the chat feature to lift up questions that occur to you as we're moving through our material today. So feel free to do that. We'll be monitoring that regularly and making sure that we create some time for those questions. So just a little bit about this session. So it will focus on strategies for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion values within interdisciplinary grant-making processes, as well as within the grant management profession, again, in higher ed and beyond. So attendees will be provided with information meant to inspire thought about approaches to aligning grant-making management processes with DEI values in favor of DEI outcomes, as well as address challenges and opportunities associated with attracting culturally diverse talent to the grant management profession in higher ed, again, and beyond. So that's just in general what we're up to. So in order to achieve our desired outcomes, we're going to be doing the following. We're going to provide a context for our work. So what should we know about DEI connected to grant making and grant management? How should or can we think about our work in this space? We're going to level set, review key DEI concepts and realities associated with our work. We're going to review the current DEI status of grant making and grant management professions, consider where DEI values and outcomes are actively promoted in grant making and higher ed and beyond, engage in an activity to promote sharing, learning, and community building, and also explore methods which grant makers and grant management professionals can implement to promote DEI values and processes and outcomes. And I am going to do the unthinkable. I am actually going to have to grab my charger because I just got a notification that I'm going to lose power, which I didn't do before we started. So just one moment and then we'll move forward.
No problem at all. Carmen, that happens to me once in an auditorium full of people. I was presenting to a huge room and realized I was just about to run out of power.
Oh my gosh, well, so that is validating, Casey. Thank you for that. That had never happened to me. That was really scary. So I'm glad that it wasn't the same situation, but I really appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so thanks everyone for your patience. So now we're gonna move on to the providing the context for our work section here. So again, just building our foundation for getting into the heart and soul, if you will, of today's session. So really thinking about what it means to be an empowered grant management professional and building your capacity to promote DEI in your practices as such. So of course, this is a moment of reflection, given the challenges we're facing with COVID, et cetera. And so really important to think about that, for instance, as a context for thinking about this work. So with a pandemic as the backdrop to everything we do and every decision we make right now, we sit in a transitional space. The time in between what we were pre-pandemic and who we will become post-pandemic. Things that felt impossible to change just last year have changed 3 times since. Over the past 5 months, grants management professionals have played a critical role in rapidly adapting grant making practice in response to the pandemic, proving their critical and increasingly strategic role. The playbook on how to make grants has been upended, and we now have an opportunity to write a new playbook, one that supports a more just, inclusive, and equitable world. So I'm actually wondering, as I read through this material here, and there's a little bit more to share, I'm actually just wondering how each of you in this space feels when you read this. If you are feeling a sense of empowerment, if this is your experience with respect to this particular moment, and how does it resonate with you to think of yourselves in this way? As the role of data and technology has grown in importance in relation to strategic decision making, grants professionals are mastering cross-functional competencies like operations, technology, finance and compliance, program and mission-based work, knowledge management and evaluation, and strategic management. Lots of intersections here with respect to your work. And that's something to elevate and to appreciate, if you will, when we think about your potential or capacity to promote, prioritize DEI values in your work. This increased breadth of skill has led grants managers to be more focused on the human side of their work as well. So change management, collaboration and partnerships, thinking about power dynamics, community engagement, and racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. So again, lots of ways in which to think about the importance of your work as a professional in this field. So what's at stake when we fail to apply a DEI lens supported by intentional strategies to stem grant making, for instance? So as a nation, we're actively discouraging, for instance, students of color from seeking a quality STEM education. Our most pressing challenges, from climate change to health to economic growth, and our most potent opportunities require problem-solving skills rooted in STEM. 10 of the top 14 fastest growing industries require some kind of STEM training. Yet, according to a team led by Raj Chetty, a Harvard economist and director of Opportunity Insights, we're losing innovators and their breakthroughs every day because people who could have had highly impactful innovations aren't being given the opportunities they deserve. So, these are the sorts of narratives we hear so often connected with STEM opportunities. And I think so often, in fact, that it's easy to take this reality for granted. But there are real structures, systems, factors at play here, which are restricting opportunities, for instance, for students and professionals of color in these areas. And some of what we're doing today is talking about those contributing factors. So here's an opening prompt for all of you in this space. We're going to give you 1 minute or so to think about how you'd like to respond to this question. And if you've got something to write with, or you'd like to type out just a brief response, just thoughts, words, phrases that come to mind for you in response to this question, that'd be great. And later, when we get to the discussion portion of the session, you can then share how you responded to this. So where and or in what ways are diversity, equity, and inclusion values promoted and or prioritized in your grant making process? Where do you experience and or observe DEI values promoted throughout the grant management profession? So internal or external to your organization. So you can think about this as a profession. You can think about this question with respect to your organization or institution or department even. So lots of ways to think about it, but just in general, where are diversity, equity, and inclusion values promoted and or prioritized or advanced, if you will, given consideration in your grant making process or in the grant management professional or profession? So we're going to take a minute with this. Okay, so gather your thoughts and then we'll move on afterward. So continue to ponder that. Again, we're going to get to the piece of the session where you can share out what came to mind for you in the interest of encouraging learning and growth for all attendees in today's session. Okay, so part one, level setting. So we definitely want to define what we're talking about when we reference DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion, and consider its connection and those connections, if you will, to grant making and the grant management profession. So when we talk about diversity, really what we're talking about is representation. This is the extent to which a community, a profession, or an organization, an industry, et cetera, is represented by a range of different cultures, races, and identities. So again, this is one layer of DEI work, is to think about our cultural representation, right? Representation of people across demographics. I mean, really and truly, we're talking in a lot of ways about numbers. So it's really sort of a surface level way of thinking about this subject, but it starts with diverse representation, right? That's separate from the idea of equity, inclusion, et cetera, which we'll also define here, diversity. So I've included this diagram because it helps folks to really think about various dimensions, if you will, of identity and how identity shapes and frames our thinking about difference, about others, quote unquote, and about ourselves. So the center of the wheel represents dimensions of diversity that are usually most permanent or visible or apparent or perceivable, right? The outside of the wheel represents dimensions that can change and are less apparent or visible. So you see there again in the center, you've got that reference to age, gender identity or expression, gender, national origin, sexual orientation, mental or physical ability, and then race and ethnicity. Again, those are aspects of identity which are usually most permanent or visible. And then of course, on the outside, you see references to other things, education, family, language and communication, religion, et cetera, which represent dimensions that are typically or usually changeable, less apparent, less visible, fluid, et cetera, not as quote unquote fixed, if you will. And in the center of that wheel, those tend to be those dimensions of identity where we see the most, if you will, disparities in life outcomes, right? So the unevenness in ways in which people experience life with respect to access to education, healthcare, employment, et cetera, are most often drawn, those disparities, across those lines, across race, ethnicity, age, gender, national origin, et cetera. So what are we talking about when we talk about inclusion? So this puts the concept of diversity to work, creating an environment or culture of involvement, respect, where the richness of ideas reflecting diverse backgrounds is harnessed to create value within a process or a practice, ultimately benefiting and equitably prioritizing diverse cultural needs. Okay. So, you know, you may have heard before the analogy that diversity is sort of, it's sort of like being asked to a dance or to an event, but inclusion is being asked to dance at that event. It's about involvement, engagement, participation. We're not just talking about numbers and or, you know, which demographics, identities, cultures are represented in a space. We are talking about the extent to which folks are engaging, participating, contributing, if you will, to our processes and practices. Okay, so equity and inequity. So this term still tends to trip a lot of people up. And so we really want to make sure we're clear on what we're talking about. So often in this work, terms are used interchangeably. So we want to make sure that we're clear on what we mean when we use these terms moving forward. So inequity refers to the opposite of equity and represents the historical and current reality of our society in many contexts, that is, inequity. In contrast to equity, inequity refers to an unevenness or disparity in how some people experience things and or in how they are impacted by something. So for instance, racial inequities refer to disparate, uneven ways in which data reveals that BIPOC, so that's Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, have less access to resources for healthcare, employment, housing, etc., compared to whites. For instance, in a racially equitable society, these disparities would not exist on the basis of race. So there might be disparities based on gender or age or ability, for instance. But in a racially equitable society, we would not see the disparities that we so often do across race, right? So when we have, as a society, realized racially equitable outcomes, there are no more disparities or unevenness between the ways in which BIPOC or Black, Indigenous people of color experience life compared to whites. When we can no longer see that race is a factor in that, we can say that we live in a racially equitable society. But until that time, right, the reality is that there are many, many inequities on the basis of race. Okay. So a word on why many agencies, organizations, and institutions are prioritizing racial equity as part of their DEI agenda. And this is because, as I just mentioned, based on the data, race, more than any other identity category, is the greatest predictor and influencer of life outcomes. When intersected with other identity factors like gender, age, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, data shows even greater disparities in life outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So for instance, if we think about life outcomes for women of color, LGBTQIA and or gender nonconforming folks of color, for instance, we tend to see even greater disparities compounded by those intersecting identities. It's really important to understand this. And this is why, we have, there's so much focus on racial equity with respect to grant making, STEM professions, et cetera. There's so much data that speaks to the necessity of applying a racial equity lens to those processes for this reason. So I believe this is our last level setting term, unconscious implicit cultural bias. So unconscious feelings we have towards other people, which lead us to making judgments based on culture, identity, et cetera, is what we're talking about when we reference unconscious implicit cultural bias. So this sort of judgment, right, unconscious, unintentional, unwitting judgment is informed by messaging, cultural trends, and societal influences. Biases are often based on stereotypes rather than actual knowledge of an individual or circumstance. There are many forms of cultural bias, including racial bias, gender bias, bias informed by an individual's ability or disability, et cetera. So of course, whether positive or negative, these cognitive shortcuts can result in prejudgments that lead to rash decisions and even discriminatory practices. So the challenge for us in our professions, right, is to understand how to mitigate or lessen the impact of unconscious implicit bias, right? And for those of you who are representing the grant management, grant making professions, it's a question of knowing and understanding how instances of bias can invariably sort of seep into your processes as well, and or in the ways in which it impacts the demographics of professionals representing your industry. Okay, so here's another question, and there were just two in this portion. This is the, you'll have a minute here as well. Share or think of an example where you suspect and or know that unconscious cultural bias in any form, whether it's racial, gender, on the basis of ability or disability, is impacting your grant management processes or the grant management field you represent. So an example of where you suspect or know that unconscious bias is impacting the profession or grant management processes. So take a minute there and then we'll move forward. This is really a tough one because, we're talking about unconscious implicit bias that is not overt or obvious necessarily. So how can one really know when it's having an impact, right? So really just, it's more a question of sort of, you know, where might it be, could it be that you're not necessarily aware of? That's probably more a fair question. But there can also be data that you have, right, that gives you a sense of where bias could be impacting your processes. So we'll talk a little bit about those things too. All right. So part two, the current DEI status of grant making and grant management professions from the perspective of federal and private funding resources. So an overview of the current DEI status of grant making and grant management professions across levels, right? So cultural, systemic, institutional, industry, America is changing. Are grant making processes and the grant management profession changing with it? So consider the following. Of 37 million Americans, 12% of the population is disabled. More than 50% of disabled Americans are of working age. In the workforce in 2022, there will be 10% more Black or African Americans, 24% more Asian Americans, and 38% more Latinx communities. That's a year from now. Nearly 2/3 of American voters are in favor of federal laws that protect LGBT individuals from employment discrimination. Nearly 2/3 are in favor of such laws. According to the last census, whites are the minority in 22 of the largest 100 metro areas. Whites are the minority. So going back to that question at the top of the slide, America is changing. Are grant making processes and the grant management profession changing with it? So I'm wondering how you all feel about that, what you think about that. Is it your sense or your experience that your profession is changing, is aligned with these cultural changes, these demographic changes, if you will? Really curious to know that. Would love your thoughts on that in the interest of conversation and learning and growing for the group. So we'll revisit that question as well. Demographics of the grant management profession. So as I'm reading through this material and you're reading it on your screen, just wondering what you think about these demographics. Is this your experience? Is this what you witness, observe, see in your profession? Is this what you would have suspected or expected? So Peak's 2020 Grants Management Salary Report found that grants management is heavily populated by women, accounting for 80% of respondents. Yet even with the dominance of women across the field, there remains a troubling difference between men's and women's salaries that echoes overall US statistics. The profession is also more diverse than the rest of philanthropy, with 39% of respondents reporting they're non-white. However, diversity goes down as decision-making authority goes up. Only 16% of those in executive positions are non-white, according to Peak's survey. So remember, we were talking about that before, right? This idea of diversity, right? In terms of numbers and representation. Some organizations, are able to publicize how diverse they are. But when looking at and thinking about this from the perspective of professional levels and throughout the hierarchy, if you will, of the organization, right, there tends to be a lot less diversity with respect to race and gender in some professions in those senior leadership decision-making positions. They're saying the same is true in the grant management profession. So where is diversity, equity, and inclusion actively promoted in grant making and the grant management profession and higher ed and beyond? Where is that happening? Is it happening? And what are some of the models even for this work? Do they exist? These are some of the most common questions I typically get in this work, right? For most institutions and organizations, they really want to know who's doing what and what are the benchmarks, right, for instance. I'm going to take a look at some aspects of this. So from the National Institute of Health, every facet of the US scientific research enterprise, from basic laboratory research to clinical and translational research to information, requires superior intellect, creativity, and a wide range of skill sets and viewpoints. NIH's ability to help ensure that the nation remains a global leader in scientific discovery and innovation is dependent upon a pool of highly talented scientists from diverse backgrounds who will help to further NIH's mission. Okay, so NIH is talking here about the importance of diversity, et cetera, right? Moving forward, still again from NIH. NIH encourages institutions to diversify their student and faculty populations to enhance the participation of individuals from groups that are underrepresented in the biomedical, clinical, behavioral, and social sciences. Says that the NIH encourages this. There are many benefits that flow from a diverse NIH-supported scientific fostering scientific innovation, enhancing global competitiveness, contributing to robust learning environments, improving the quality of the research, advancing the likelihood that underserved or health disparity populations participate in and benefit from health research, and enhancing public trust. Right? We're hearing a lot about the ways in which, for instance, underserved, marginalized, underrepresented, if you will, communities, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, lack trust in the healthcare system, industry, institution, et cetera. And we're seeing glaring consequences in this moment of COVID associated with that. Part of that is, right, informed by or a consequence of, if you will, the lack of diverse representation in certain fields and industries, right? So, you know, the more industries, institutions, grant making professions, for instance, all professions, right? The more we perpetuate, if you will, or invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? The more we're able to do to promote and prioritize it. It begets increasingly diverse professional fields. It builds public trust on the part of diverse, underserved, vulnerable communities in those institutions and industries. The more diverse they become, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So we're talking here, right? The NIH is talking here about the sort of resonating impact of DEI and that it can have on this profession. So from STEM Funders Network. So again, just really thinking about how DEI values are being promoted by some of our most, influential institutions, right? So from STEM Funders Network, the STEM Funders Network is calling on all corporate and private philanthropies to take action in eliminating racial biases and inequity in the United States. So this is an explicit call to focus on racial inequity from the As a community of funders, we see education as the great equalizer. We're committed to ensuring that all young people have equitable access and opportunities in education. All of us need to do our part to root out systemic racism in our country and this explicit calling out of racism in particular. Corporate and private philanthropies wield considerable social and economic power in the US. However, we need to do better in leveraging our resources to help achieve racial equality in our country. We need to lean in and be part of the solution as corporate and private philanthropic institutions. So just looking at language here that speaks to how some of our most powerful, influential funders, resources, institutions are responding to the challenge of promoting, prioritizing, and the necessity of promoting and prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The National Science Foundation's Office for Diversity and Inclusion, quote, works across the foundation and with the NSF awardee community to promote diversity and inclusion, provide equal opportunity and access, and eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment, and retaliation in employment, NSF, and in participation with NSF funded or conducted programs. So this is lifted straight from their website, right? So I have here in bold because this is important to note, right? We've been reading through and I've been sharing with you language that speaks to These institutions, right, in grant making, right, these institutions support, if you will, or express support for diversity, equity, and inclusion in their practices. However, as I state here, regardless of these expressed missions and value statements, without the investment of strategies meant to ensure DEI aligned grant making processes as well as within the profession, there's very little chance that such outcomes can be realized for the benefit of industry and global interests. So it's about more than just talking about it. It's, putting strategies in place, being proactive, being responsive to DEI related challenges when it comes to grant making, and increasing the diversity, if you will, of grant making or grant management professionals at every level. So let's just take a moment here to pause before we look at some other information of interest to this work and to encourage thought, provoke thought for all of you in this profession and given what you do. And given the roles that you play in creating opportunities, ensuring opportunities for professionals, communities, et cetera, through your grant making process. At this point, would anyone like to share a response, for instance, to either of those two reflective questions? So the first one being, where are you in your grant making processes promoting or prioritizing or considering diversity, equity, and inclusion? And where are you seeing that happen in the grant management profession? Or that second question, which had to do with, do you have a sense of, or do you know whether or not or where the reality of unconscious implicit cultural bias might be influencing or impacting your process? Would anyone like to share what they wrote or what they were thinking about with those questions, and whether or not you had a clear answer? You just had a minute, it's okay. But what sort of occurred to you as you were thinking about those? So we'll just take a moment to see what folks are wanting to share, and you can either use the raise your hand feature or type something into the chat if you like. We're monitoring both. Shy, contemplative, reflective folks on the call, maybe. Any questions that occurred to you? And you can also think about it this way. What was challenging? If those questions were challenging for you, why were they challenging for you? Let's really use this time to support each other in this work.
I guess one thing I noted, because I mentioned it because I noted it in an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that I think was just today, which was about a survey that showed salary inequity in terms of I think it was a survey of the top earners at institutions of higher education and what that looked like and how heavily that was skewed toward white men. So I mentioned it as potentially, unconscious bias, or maybe not even unconscious bias. I'm not sure, being behind those statistics.
Mm-hmm. And that was just today, Casey, really?
Today or yesterday, really recent, yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, when I shared for folks on the call, when we shared the slide that had to do with the statistics of the demographics of the grant management profession, I'm also wondering too what folks thought about that. So we'll just pause here for just another moment to see if there are thoughts folks want to share, just reactions, what's new to you, maybe what's familiar to you. Where are you feeling sort of challenged right now with respect to this subject? Are you at a loss when it comes to sort of what to do and how to think about this? Any comments or questions at all at this point?
So I don't know how to use the raise your hand feature on Zoom, so hopefully it's okay that I'm just speaking up here. So I think for my organization, so we're UCAR, we're a nonprofit located in Boulder, Colorado. And we do have a DEI office who does a lot of work within our organization on really focusing our efforts on DEI. But I think, I guess a question I have for you, since you open it up as sort of thoughts on questions. When we look at those things in the wheel that you showed that are what you call the less apparent items, right, where we might face equity issues and things like that, and there are things like education and other things along those lines. you know, certainly within our profession, we do have, as with most professions, have minimum like education requirements for even being considered for opportunities and things like that, right? And even thinking about it like from a cultural perspective, like you have to have a great grasp of the English language to be able to handle contracts and things such as that. So I guess I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts are around how you actually diversify in those areas given those sort of restraints.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that is such a great question. And what's your name, by the way?
Sorry, Amy
No,
Smith.
that's totally fine. Amy, thank you so much. And thanks for kicking us off here. And just really, um, having the courage to ask a question like that. It's such an important question. And it's so fundamental to this work. I mean, so not to get too sort of deep on this subject, but I will say that in my work in supporting, institutions, organizations, agencies, really trying to do more in the quote unquote DEI space, a lot of it has to do with sort of doing this really sort of, taking a close, if you will, critical look at requirements with preferred qualifications, also, if you will, connected to a professional's responsibilities. So, what are the reasons behind, some of the things we're asking for, right? Are we just used to asking for and setting terms, if you will, in a certain way? That's just the way we've done it. Have we really reflected on what the responsibilities really need? The bias could be creeping in, right, to the extent that we're not thinking about transferable or translatable skills that could be acquired in maybe less conventional ways for folks whose, educational path or professional path or career development path might be a little bit different, right, than the average professional, in our field, for instance. It's really sort of a matter of questioning sort of, what is it, behind our rationale for requiring certain skill sets, credentials, et cetera, over others? And just taking a close look at that and just asking yourself, Amy, that question, I mean, to your point, right? Because without asking these kinds of questions, you're right, Amy, you're really restricted and limited in terms of what you can do to promote DEI, to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it really does start with this question, where are we working against ourselves? If we are really truly invested in promoting and prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion, where could we potentially be inhibiting, right, our efforts to do that? Working against ourselves, again, unconsciously, unwittingly, right? In order to be able to know where you can make adjustments, accommodations, amendments, et cetera, it really does, Amy, to your point, start with and that can be a difficult process for folks because what you're really asking people to do is basically challenge everything they've been thinking about, right? With respect to some of, with respect to, our professions, with respect to education, with respect to opportunity, access, et cetera. You're asking folks literally, right, to rethink how they think about these issues. And that's really difficult. So, I talked earlier on one of those earlier slides, I was talking about grant management professionals and all of the various interdisciplinary, intersectional skill sets you all bring to your work, right? And one of the things that was referenced there was change management, right? So that's all connected, what I just described, sort of connected to change management processes, right? Which really sort of encourage folks to reflect deeply and carefully, not on what they're doing, but how they're doing it. So yeah, that's a great question, Amy. Thank you so much for that. Any other thoughts or responses or reactions to what Amy lifted up? And if that sort of resonates with you or is relatable to you before we move forward?
I have one thing that came up back when I was working in an office of sponsored programs. A lot of times in universities, you have a position, you want it to be at a certain pay level because you want to offer a certain level of compensation, and you might not have control over what the university has as just requirements to hire anyone in at that level. But what our office did is there was the option, a department had to opt into it, to offer so many years of experience as a replacement for 1 year of like a college degree. But then the second part of follow through that made that really viable, because that could be a huge barrier, is making sure there were entry level positions that did not require a degree, where experience in those positions could count towards that. And then they had experience internally and they could say, we know this person, and justify it to HR. So really building not just how many people do we need to get the job done, but building a set of positions that's designed to facilitate a certain progression within your office, I think is really important, especially when you're limited by, you know, a hierarchical HR you might not have control over.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, what was your name again?
Victor.
Victor, thank you. Oh my gosh, that's such a great example of a proactive process or step that could be implemented, right, in the interest of growing and developing and nurturing diverse talent, right, and creating greater access to opportunity for you know, the next generation of professionals. That is an example of something that can be done. That's actually right. We're moving beyond words and expressing our commitment like in a mission statement, but we're actually taking steps to change the culture, if you will, the profession. That's a great example of that. Yeah, thank you.
It's Marisa.
Yeah.
I would say that an additional barrier would be the actual HR system, or
Yes.
the automated, you know, application system, where if the trend in when I left Johns Hopkins was that you need a finance degree or you need to be a JD in order to work in contracts.
Mm.
If somebody worked in accounting, you know, or worked in grants for so many years, can't even get through that first hurdle of having their application read and sent to the department for review.
Mm.
I knew so many people who were, you know, denied even that first step, and it's really terrible. To answer probably, I think it was your second question about implicit bias. I think for me, what I saw a lot was where people who didn't have English as their first language, it was very difficult for them to also, you know, we had plenty of people that were trying to get jobs, but they couldn't get through the interview process, or that faculty, you know, who may be immigrants or who may be on a visa, they don't have the same access that they would have if they had a better command of the language. When I was in an administrator position, I really made it a point to, you know, give people enough time to feel comfortable. Because when English isn't your first language, it can be really difficult, especially in the first like 10 minutes. You can't win them over because you're so nervous, right? So I would often find that, you know, I'll be there for an hour, but I'm waiting until they get comfortable, because I know that in their native language that they can answer these questions really well. And that was really important for me to get it out for them. And I found that, you know, people that weren't getting a chance, or who were applying to so many different positions, you know, just giving them the chance, and I could see them really advance in their careers. So, you know, to me, that was part of my own effort to increase inclusion. And then my final point, sorry,
Yeah,
I
no,
need
no,
to
no.
reflect. I was blinded for a while. You know, full disclosure, Connor and I used to work in the same organization, a housing nonprofit. And before she came, we had kicked off, because of what happened with Freddie Gray, we kicked up our DEI efforts at the nonprofit. And when you talk about, it's not just, you know, holding up these values or saying this is part of our vision. What is it that you are doing? What's the action that you are doing to uphold those visions? And so at the nonprofit, we went through this whole training, you know, people were chosen to go through this training, but then we were asked to, you know, how do you infuse DEI into each department? So I was the director of grants and contracts, and how were we as grant makers holding that as one of our values. And what we did was, for one of our really big grants that we were giving to community-based organizations, is one part of it was that they had to answer how they were applying DEI to their work. And it wasn't just that we were going to check on them and whatever, but we wanted them to look at their work through that lens. And it was really just by introducing that mindset, I think was a way that we were living the vision.
Yes.
So that's all.
Oh my gosh, Marissa, thank you so much for lifting up those really powerful examples of what we as individuals can do. And thanks for, using yourself as an example there, right? Because we're all implicated in these challenges, every single one of us, which means that we all have the power and the capacity to actually work in favor and in the interest of equity, diversity, and inclusion as well. So thank you for sharing with us a personal example of how you were doing that in a previous position, and also how you have done that throughout your career in various positions, right? To really sort of, translate the importance of these and to encourage and inspire, right, stakeholders to also themselves invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there are no shortages of examples that if we all thought about it, we could list that would reflect and could reflect that we are prioritizing and promoting DEI in our practices and within our profession. So yeah, Marissa, Victor, Amy, thank you all, Casey, so much. That's great. Okay, so last section here, we want to give folks an idea of what you can do, right, in your practices to promote DEI values. So some of our sources include Council on Foundations, Arabella Advisors, Grant Makers for Education, and Grant Makers in the Arts. So grant professionals can do the tough work of helping their organizations put a mirror up to themselves to reflect, to ask questions about how these practices align with DEI values, their current practices. This gets to Amy's earlier question. Grant professionals can make strategic efforts around streamlining application and reporting processes, implementing more flexible and trusting procedures in due diligence and grant structure, and using feedback from grantees and their community to inform a process that leads to stronger partnerships. They can also harness the power of grant reports to find the information that matters most, partnering with grantees and communities to learn together, amplify what works, and ask for help with challenges that can be tackled collectively. And also to use what's learned to fuel even greater and deeper impacts. So, right, and in my mind, I'm envisioning, maybe the next time you all have an opportunity perhaps to gather around a subject like this, you can start to share what you're doing or what you learned since this session, and certain strategies or steps you're putting into place to promote and prioritize DEI, and what you're learning from that. And that helps to build a professional community of practice in this space. You can also examine your processes across the grant-making lifecycle to determine the ways in which, again, unconscious bias could be impacting decisions, manage diverse and inclusive external review committees, and use data collection and analysis acumen to collect and use demographic data to inform your org's impact on communities of color. Be open and supportive of conversations around risk management and apply an equity lens to legal and financial compliance and due diligence traditions that have traditionally meant organizations that are led by people of color are chronically under-resourced and over-monitored. So looking at the conventional ways in which you do your work and in which your processes are carried out, really taking a look at those traditions and those legacies and those historiographies to see where you can update, make adjustments, et cetera, as you learn more about the ways in which some communities are disadvantaged and others are over-advantaged, right, when it comes to opportunity with respect to grants. Challenge your professional community and yourselves to be responsible for and engage in personal growth and learning around justice and systemic oppression. Create the spaces to hold up a critical lens to yourselves. Grant management processes and the root causes of injustice in American society, this is all tied to the work, all the great work that you all do. Convene leaders in your profession to contemplate strategies for working in a coordinated way to advocate for DEI-aligned grant management processes to favorably impact the profession and diverse communities served through your resources. Lastly, a few other ideas here with respect to the profession itself. As we've discussed, hiring staff with diverse perspectives, lived experiences, and viewpoints is critical. Integrating demographic analysis throughout your grant management processes, regularly assessing how equitable your grant making or management process is, and taking corrective steps to balance gaps. Being accessible and willing to meet people and prospective grantees where they are. Oh my gosh, that's so important, right? So demonstrating advocacy for access to diverse folks in that way. So in the last few minutes that we have here, just wanting to encourage you all to consider how many of those strategies you believe are accessible to you or your institution or your organization or your team. Where can or do you see yourself intervening or disrupting in favor of diversity, equity, and inclusion values and outcomes in your processes and profession? You know, this is tough work to do this, right? But the risk, of course, of not working in favor of diversity, equity, and inclusion in your grant making processes and or throughout your profession, right? The risk is that things don't change. The status quo remains. Communities, right, remain, you know, locked outside of access to opportunities, et cetera. Some folks are overadvantaged, others disadvantaged when we don't commit to this work. So given the reality of systemic, cultural, and institutional challenges associated with ensuring DEI-aligned grant making and or management processes and within the industry, again, where do you believe you have the greatest potential to favorably impact or promote those values in your own processes or role? And we don't actually have 5 minutes to do this, but if we did, we would use some time to do this, but we can, we have at least a few more minutes left, not quite 5, but is there anyone who would like to share just reactions, responses to the list of strategies, options that we've shared with you for things that you could do or consider doing within your orgs, institutions, teams, et cetera? Anyone like to share that, or did none of them feel accessible to you? And if not, you can also share why that's the case as well.
Hi, so I'm Christine. I'm from University of Maryland. We're like one of the big school.
Yeah.
I think we have, I am so fortunate to work in a big, you know, university where, and the location wise, it's DMV, which means that there are a lot of different race, not only the race, but like age group, you know, like I work with 60-plus-year-old lady who's like sitting right next to me. You know, it's an interesting field plus area to live in. But I wanna, as a person who never thought about, you know, like diversity, inclusion, plus like grant making, that's the reason why I came actually to this session, because I really didn't think about it when I was working in this field. And as a person, you know, female, Asian, like I never thought about it. But I realized more and more as you are kind of talking and others were kind of speaking, I realized that this, you know, people might be more comfortable with me because of my race or because of my sex, you know? So I feel very happy and I'm glad that I'm in field of where I am, because I really did not know that this field existed when I graduated from college. I think a lot of people do. And I just have to appreciate my college and my team members that, you know, they don't let me feel that I am excluded, or, you know, they listen to me and they even ask like, hey, I have, you know, PI whose first language is not English, like how can I assist? because English is not my first language either. So they ask, and I have to thank my Zoom because, you know, using the Zoom and then just pointing at them where it is, you know, just explaining, just having the face to the name, all of those really help. So like the one takeaway or I want to mention to, you know, within this group is that, you know, making sure that, you know, you become friendly to those who you might associate differently than who you are. So like for me, just having that association with different race, different age group, different sex or sexual orientation, all of those are, you know, and just become I don't want to say friends, but because it's so cliche, but but I think that's what it is, you know, having the friendly environment to talk about these things. I think that's like one thing that made me very feel comfortable with my group at least. So I think I'm gonna write to my team member saying, you know, this is what I learned. Like, thank you. I really did not associate grant making process with, you know, diversity inclusion, but that is because of them or because of us, you know, in here. I really thank you.
Oh my gosh. Listen, tell me your name again.
I'm Christine.
Christine, thank you so much for being so generous with your comments and your experiences, and that you've learned something here today that you can share, but also that you've also discussed, you know, the importance of feeling included and valued as a team member. And that's really what we're talking about. And that's what we're going for, right? Everyone deserves to experience that. Christine, thank you so much for that. I cannot think of a better way to wrap up this session than with Christine's contributions and all of your contributions, and that you've invested this time. I know we're at time. So out of respect for your time and appreciation for all of you, thank you so much for taking the time in this conversation, and reach out if you've got additional questions or would like to continue the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.